The marriage didn't break. Marriages don't break. They bend, slowly and perceptibly, like metal under constant pressure, heating and cooling and heating again until the shape changes completely, but the material remains. I bent for 5 years, bent so gradually I didn't notice I was bending, didn't recognize the shape I was taking, didn't understand that bending was permanent, that once you bend past a certain point you can't straighten. The original shape is gone, replaced by whatever form the pressure created. I looked at my marriage one day and couldn't remember what straight felt like, couldn't recall the shape I'd been before the bending started. 5 years of bending, 5 years of small adjustments, minor accommodations, slight shifts in position and posture and presentation, each bend seeming temporary, seeming recoverable, seeming like normal relationship flexibility. But bends compound, accumulate, layer upon layer until you're living in a shape you never chose, a shape you didn't design, a shape that exists solely to accommodate pressure, to reduce friction, to make his life easier by making yourself smaller, more compact, more convenient, less obstructive, less demanding, less present. I've been at the beginning, bent during the engagement, bent more after the wedding, bent continuously through year 1, year 2, year 3, bent until bending became my natural state, until I couldn't remember what unbent felt like, until the bent version felt like the only version that had ever existed. The original straight me became a distant memory, a stranger, someone I used to be before I learned that love meant bending, that partnership meant contorting, that marriage meant reshaping yourself into whatever form creates the least resistance. I'm 34, I left 8 months ago. I'm still trying to straighten, still trying to return to some version of my original shape, but bending changes you at the molecular level changes. The structure itself, you can't simply unbend and return to what you were. The material has been altered, the integrity compromised. Some bends are permanent, some shapes can't be reversed. I'm learning to accept that I'll never be exactly who I was before the bending, learning to build a new shape from the bent material that remains. When you find yourself constantly adjusting, constantly accommodating, constantly making yourself smaller to fit his life, when you can't remember the last time you stood straight, when bending has become so automatic you don't notice you're doing it, when you've forgotten what your original shape even was, you haven't broken. Broken would be easier. Broken gets attention, gets intervention, gets repair. You've bent, and bending is invisible, as gradual, as something you do to yourself while telling yourself you're being flexible, being mature, being a good wife. If you've ever described your marriage as work without being able to articulate what the work entails, if you found yourself constantly adjusting your position to reduce conflict, if you've realized you're living in a shape you don't recognize, if you've noticed that you're smaller now than when you started, don't comment. Just notice the bending. Notice how complete it is. Notice how it happened without a single breaking point. Notice that you participated fully while believing you were just being accommodating. Because what I'm about to describe is the mechanism of bending, how pressure applied consistently over time changes your fundamental shape, how you bend yourself to avoid breaking, how the bending feels like preservation but is actually deformation. I met him when I was 26, he was 30, I was finishing graduate school, starting my career, building my life, felt strong, capable, clear about my direction, had ambitions, had plans, had a shape I'd spent years creating, a shape I liked. He seemed attracted to that shape, seemed to admire my strength, my clarity, my independence, said he loved how I knew what I wanted, how I went after it, how I didn't need anyone to complete me. I believed him, believed he wanted me as I was believed the shape I built was the shape he valued. The first bend came during the engagement, subtle, barely noticeable. We were planning the wedding. I had ideas, clear vision. He had different ideas, different vision. We discussed, we negotiated, I bent. Told myself it didn't matter. Told myself weddings are about compromise. Told myself one day doesn't define a marriage. I've been on the venue, been on the guest list, bent on the ceremony structure, bent on small details that seemed insignificant in isolation, but together represented a pattern. The pattern of my preferences bending to accommodate his, my vision bending to reduce conflict, my shape beginning to change under the first applications of pressure. A second bend came after the wedding. We discussed where to live. I wanted the city, walkable, public transit. Close to my work, he wanted suburbs, yard, quiet space. Said city living stressed him out. Said he needed nature, needed peace. I said, okay, we can compromise, found a place between, not quite city, not quite suburbs. Told myself it was fair, told myself both of us were bending, but I was the one with the longer commute. I was the one who gave up walkability. I was the one whose daily life became harder. I bent my location, my daily routine, my access to the things I valued. Told myself it was temporary. Told myself we'd move eventually. Told myself this was what marriage looked like. The third bend came with my career. I'd been offered a promotion, more responsibility, more travel, more hours, exciting opportunity, career advancement I'd been working toward. He said it's a lot of time away from home, said he'd feel abandoned, said marriages need presence, said career isn't everything, asked if I'd consider staying at my current level, just for now, just until we're more established, just until we have kids, just temporarily. I turned down the promotion, told myself family comes first, told myself there would be other opportunities, told myself sacrificing career advancement was what good wives do. Didn't recognize I was bending my future, my trajectory, my professional shape to fit his comfort level with my absence. Year one, I bent my schedule. He needed consistency, needed routine, needed dinner at the same time, needed predictable patterns. I'd been spontaneous, flexible, comfortable with uncertainty. I bent, created routines, established patterns, made my days predictable, made my presence reliable, made my schedule accommodate his need for structure, told myself structure is good, told myself routines are healthy, told myself I was growing up, didn't recognize I was bending my natural rhythm to match his, changing my temporal shape to reduce his anxiety. I bent my friendships. He didn't particularly like my friends, said they were too loud, too dramatic, too much. Didn't explicitly forbid me from seeing them. It just made it difficult, made plans that conflicted, expressed disappointment when I chose them, seemed hurt when I prioritized other relationships. Gradually, I saw them less, bent my social life around his comfort, bent my friendships into shapes that didn't. Threaten him, eventually bent them. So much they broke, fell away, left me isolated, left me shaped entirely around him with no other forms to reference. I bent my body. He preferred me thinner, didn't say it directly, just made comments. Observations, suggestions. You'd look great if you toned up. I knew someone who did this diet. Have you thought about running? I bent, started restricting, started exercising more, started shrinking myself physically to match his preference. Told myself I wanted to be healthy, told myself I was doing this for me. Didn't recognize I was literally bending my physical form to accommodate his aesthetic preferences, making myself smaller in the most literal sense. I bent my family relationships. He found them intrusive, said they called too much, visited too much, had opinions too much, asked if I'd set better boundaries, asked if I'd limit contact, asked if I'd prioritize our marriage over their demands. I bent, called less, visited less, created distance, told myself I was establishing healthy independence, told myself I was putting my marriage first. Didn't recognize I was bending away from my origin point, from people who knew my original shape, from support systems that might notice the bending happening. Year two, the bending accelerated. I bent my opinions. He challenged them. Gently but persistently, present alternative perspectives, asked me to consider other viewpoints. Over time, my clear position softened. became more moderate, more aligned with his. I told myself I was becoming less rigid, more open-minded. Didn't recognize my intellectual shape bending to match his. My thoughts conforming to his framework. My worldview warping under constant pressure to see things his way. I bent my emotions. He couldn't handle intensity, couldn't handle sadness, couldn't handle anger, couldn't handle anything that required him to accommodate my feelings. I learned to moderate, to flatten, to present only emotions he could handle, bent my emotional expression into acceptable shapes, into manageable forms, learned to cry quietly or not at all, learned to be angry silently or not at all, learned to be sad privately or not at all, bent my emotional life into something small enough not to burden him. I bent my voice, stopped saying things that caused conflict, stopped expressing needs that inconvenienced him, stopped asking for things he'd have to give, learned to phrase everything carefully, learned to soften every request, learned to make my needs sound optional, learned to make myself easy, low maintenance, undemanding, bent my communication into shapes that never challenged him, never pressured him, never required him to bend at all. I bent my standards for him, for the marriage, for household labor, for emotional labor, for sex, for everything. My standards for partnership bent lower and lower to accommodate what he was willing to give, what he was capable of giving, what he felt like giving. I told myself I was being realistic, being mature, being understanding. Didn't recognize I was bending my expectations down to meet his minimal effort, creating a marriage where I gave everything and received whatever remained after he'd taken care of himself. Year 3, I bent my sexuality. He had specific preferences, specific requirements, specific needs. I bent myself into sexual shapes that served him, that pleased him, that met his needs regardless of mine. Told myself I was being generous, being giving, being a good sexual partner. Didn't recognize I was bending my sexual self into a form designed entirely for his pleasure, abandoning my own needs, my own desires, my own body's shape in favor of whatever shape he wanted me to take. I bent my mornings, my evenings, my weekends, my holidays, every moment of time bent around his needs, his schedule, his preferences, his comfort. I bent early when he needed me early, bent late when he needed me late, bent available when he needed availability, bent absent when he needed space. I became temporarily flexible, bent into whatever shape the moment required. Lost my own sense of timing, my own rhythm, my own natural flow. I bent my appearance, how I dressed, how I styled my hair, how I wore makeup, bent every visible aspect of myself toward his preferences, toward his aesthetic, toward what he found attractive. Told myself I was taking pride in my appearance. Told myself I wanted to look nice for him. Didn't recognize I was bending my external form to match his vision, erasing my own style, my own expression, my own visual identity. I bent my hobbies, my interests, my passions. Things I'd loved became things I used to love. Things I'd prioritized became things I used to prioritize. Everything that didn't serve the marriage, didn't include him, didn't accommodate his presence. I've been away from bent into smaller and smaller spaces, bent into corners, bent into invisibility, until the only shape I occupied was the shape of wife, the shape of accommodation, the shape of perpetual bending. Year 4, I started noticing the bending, started feeling the strain, started recognizing that I'd bent so far I didn't recognize my own shape anymore, couldn't remember what straight felt like, couldn't access the original form I'd had before the marriage, before the pressure, before the bending became automatic. I'd look at old photos, see someone standing straight, someone occupying space without apology, someone shaped like herself rather than shaped around someone else, and I'd feel grief, feel loss, feel like I was looking at someone who died. I tried to straighten, tried to unbend, tried to return to original positions, but straightening hurt. Straightening caused conflict. Straightening required him to accommodate me for once instead of me accommodating him, and he couldn't. He'd married someone bent, someone flexible, someone who made his life easy by making herself small. He didn't know how to be married to someone straight, someone solid, someone who took up space. Straightening felt like betrayal to him, felt like I was changing the terms, felt like I was becoming someone different from who he'd married. But I wasn't becoming someone different. I was trying to become someone original, trying to return to the shape I'd been before the bending, the shape he'd claimed to admire, the shape he'd said he loved. Except he hadn't loved that shape. He'd loved the potential for that shape to bend. Loved the strength because it meant I could bend further without breaking. Loved the independence because it meant I wouldn't need him to hold me up while I bent. Loved the clarity because it meant I'd bend consciously, willingly, without complaint. The marriage had never been designed for two straight people. It had been designed for one straight person and one bent person. For one person who maintained their shape, and one person who continuously accommodated. For one person who took up space, and one person who created space by making themselves smaller. I'd been bending for so long, I'd forgotten that marriage could be two people standing straight, could be mutual accommodation rather than one-directional contortion. My therapist asked me to try standing straight for 1 week, just 1 week, try not bending, try saying no when I wanted to say no, try expressing needs without softening them, try taking up space without apologizing, try being my original shape for 7 days and see what happened. I tried. I lasted 3 days before the conflict became unbearable. Before his discomfort became so intense, I bent again just to relieve the pressure, just to return to the shape he recognized, the shape he needed, the shape the marriage required. Those 3 days taught me something crucial. The marriage couldn't accommodate me straight. The structure itself required my bending, was built on my bending, depended on my bending. Without my continuous accommodation, the whole thing collapsed into conflict, into tension, into his stress at having to adjust, having to accommodate, having to experience what I'd been experiencing for years. The marriage wasn't a partnership. It was a system designed for one person's comfort, maintained by another person's deformation. I started documenting the bending, started writing down each time I adjusted, each time I accommodated, each time I made myself smaller, each time I bent. The list was extensive, daily, constant. I was bending dozens of times per day, major bends, minor bends, tiny. Micro adjustments that kept me perpetually contorted, perpetually accommodating, perpetually shaped around him. The documentation made the pattern undeniable, made the systematic nature visible, made the bending impossible to minimize or explain away. Year 5, I made a decision. I could keep bending until I broke, or I could leave while I still had some structural integrity remaining, could leave while I could still imagine straightening, could leave before the bending became so complete that the original shape was irretrievable. I chose to leave, not because the marriage was broken, because it wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. I left because I was bent, because continuing to bend would eventually break me, because I wanted a chance to straighten before the deformation became permanent. Leaving a bent marriage is different from leaving a broken marriage. Broken marriages are obvious, dramatic. Everyone understands leaving broken, but bent marriages look fine from outside, look functional, look like they're working. Leaving bent means explaining something invisible, explaining deformation no one else can see, explaining that you're not leaving because something is wrong with the marriage, but because something is wrong with your shape. Because you've been bent so long, you can't remember straight. The first few months after leaving, I tried to straighten, tried to return to original positions, but my body had adapted to being bent, muscles had shortened. Joints had adjusted, posture had changed, straightening was painful. Required physical therapy, required conscious effort, required retraining muscles that had forgotten how to hold me straight. I'd bent for so long that straight felt wrong, felt unstable, felt like I was doing it incorrectly. I started small, started with tiny adjustments, micro straightenings, said no to small things, expressed preferences about minor things, took up slightly more space, stood slightly taller. Each small straightening felt radical, felt rebellious, felt like claiming something I'd given up so long ago, I'd forgotten it was mine to claim. I practiced standing straight in front of mirrors, practiced occupying my full height, practiced taking up the space my body actually required, rather than the minimal space I'd learned to compress myself into. 8 months out, I can stand straight for longer periods, can maintain my original shape for hours at a time before I feel the pull to bend, before I feel the automatic urge to accommodate, to adjust, to make myself smaller. But the bent habits remain, the muscle memory of bending, the automatic adjustments, the reflexive accommodation. I catch myself bending when there's no pressure, bending preemptively, bending from habit rather than necessity. The bending became part of my structure, part of how I move through the world. I'm learning that some of the bending is permanent, some shapes can't be fully recovered, the material has been changed, the integrity. Compromised, I'll never be exactly who I was at 26, never return completely to my original form. But I can build something new, can create a shape that's deliberately chosen, rather than pressure formed, can stand straight, even if the straight is different. From the original straight can occupy space, even if the space is different from the space I occupied before. Here's what I desperately wish someone had told me at 26 when I met him, when I was strong and straight and clear about my shape. The first time he asks you to bend, notice it. Notice the pressure being applied. Notice that one bend leads to another. Notice that bending becomes habit. Notice that temporary accommodation becomes permanent deformation. Notice before you've bent so far you can't remember what straight feels like. Notice before the bent version becomes the only version you know. Marriages don't break, not usually they bend. One person bends. Continuously bends, so gradually they don't notice their bending bends until their original shape is gone, until they're living in a form they never chose, until they're smaller, more compact, more convenient, less obstructive than they ever intended to be. The bending feels like flexibility, like compromise, like partnership. But it's one directional, it's systematic, it's deformation disguised as accommodation. If you're reading this and you can't remember the last time you stood straight, if you've been bending so long, you've forgotten what your original shape was, if you've made yourself so small you barely exist, if you've accommodated so much there's nothing left to give, you haven't broken. Broken would be obvious. Broken would get attention, you've bent. And bending is invisible until someone points it out, until you see old photos, until you try to straighten and realize you can't, until you understand that the marriage isn't broken. You're bent, deformed, compressed into a shape designed for someone else's comfort. The path forward isn't about fixing the marriage. The marriage is functioning exactly as designed. The path forward is about straightening. About reclaiming your original height, your original space, your original shape, about learning to stand straight even when it causes conflict, even when it requires him to bend for once, even when it means the marriage can't accommodate both of you standing, about choosing your structural integrity over his comfort, choosing your shape over the shape the marriage requires. Tomorrow, I'll tell you about the moment I realized his apologies were identical. Word for word, pattern for pattern, realized every apology followed the same script, hit the same beats, created the same temporary relief that made me forget the incident, made me reset my tolerance, made me stay. The apologies weren't about remorse or change or growth. They were about reset, about erasing the incident so it wouldn't count toward the pattern, about making me forget just enough to continue. And once I saw the apology as mechanism instead of emotion, once I recognized the script, I couldn't unsee it, couldn't accept it, couldn't let it work anymore.